Hello, I'm John Atack, as if you didn't know that. And this is a man whose name I've been mispronouncing for a long time. I think his name is Yuval Laor.
It is, yes.
See, I've got there eventually. I've only known you for 7 years. So
That's right.
And for those who are not aware of Yuval, he's what's called a scholar. We do meet them occasionally. He has a PhD in cultural studies, and his PhD was called The Religious Ape. And the suggestion is that there are certain traits which are human, which lead to us exhibiting awe and fervor, which lead us to our beliefs often. And
sudden religious conversions.
And sudden religious conversions. And we both came to that through the work of William James, particularly in the Varieties of Religious Experience, where he talks about noesis, or the feelings of knowing, the feelings of being certain. And I cannot underline enough how important that is, that the sense that we know something is true. The example I always give is the born-again Christian who said to me, I don't understand the Bible, but I know it's all true. And those were feelings of knowing, not knowing based upon evidence. And what Yuval has spent his career doing is finding evidence. And we will soon have an incredible new book, or soonish, I hope, explaining the remarkable work that Yuval has done. We've recorded, you can find elsewhere on this channel various of our conversations, but you can find Yuval's presentation about awe, fervor, and belief on the channel. And I think it is at the leading edge of thinking at the moment. I am very impressed indeed, and he's not paying me to say that. Are you?
I am not. I'm paying you to say it correctly.
yeah, let's be exact about it.
Yeah.
And so when we first met, which was in June 2015 in Toronto, where Professor James Beverley and I were hosting a conference called Getting Clear of Scientology. And we had, I think, 27 speakers in all, covering all phases of Scientology from the early 60s up to Hubbard's death. We had somebody who had worked directly with him throughout the period, from Hannah Whitfield, who was with him in the early 60s and was one of the original C organization members, one of the 19 people that formed the C Project, it was originally called, through to Jesse Prince, who'd been reporting directly to Hubbard right up to his death. And we had legal experts. We had Chris Shelton gave his third talk there. He's now given about 17,000. And Yuval came up to me and said, I've been using your work for the last 20 years or whatever. It's like,
yeah.
It's one of those moments like when Jimi Hendrix went up to Buddy Guy and said, I learned so much from you. And Buddy Guy said, I didn't get no checks. But during those few days, Yuval brought the Bear and Fedio checklist of the traits of temporal lobe epilepsy to me and said, what do you think? Did Hubbard have these 18 characteristics? And I sat down and I ticked off 17 of them without really having to think very much about it, once he'd explained what they meant to me. And the 18th took me about half an hour to get to. So I was convinced then and there that we're dealing with, in Hubbard, we're dealing with a man who had a particular and significant disorder, which does not necessarily make people bad because they have temporal lobe epilepsy, but with everything else that was going on with Hubbard, it made him very bad indeed. And he did a tremendous amount of harm to all and sundry, all the people around him. A horribly selfish, destructive, and sadistic human being. So what we're going to do is, we did this once before and we recorded a whole thing, I think at the end of 2015. And we had a PR guy working with us at the time, and he didn't like the camera angle and stuff like that. And then a week later, you went back home to Colorado and did a show with Chris Shelton about
Chris Shelton, yeah.
And as I recollect, a Swedish neurologist who'd been a professor at an Ivy League university, was now emeritus, retired, contacted you and confessed that for something like 30 years, he'd been fascinated by Ron Hubbard and he'd been collecting all this material. And he'd also been there in 1977 when Bear and Fedio gave the first public talk about temporal lobe epilepsy, their first public talk about it. And he had not connected the two things. And he contacted you after the show you did with Chris to say, absolutely. So we have had a professional opinion on this matter.
Yes, but we need to stress that we are not diagnosing anybody because we've never met Hubbard. This is not a diagnosis.
We won't be treating him in any way.
This is just speculating based on what we know about him. Yeah.
Yeah, and in the hope that it gives a better understanding of why he behaved in the way that he did, because he was compelled to behave in that way.
And hopefully people who have were damaged by him, it might help them switch, part of the anger that they might have towards him to pitying him, because it is a very, very horrible condition, especially when untreated. And of course, he was untreated for it.
No, I mean, an interesting.
But I mean, we still need to be angry at him, but we can also pity.
Yes, and I think it's healthier, and it makes the anger less consuming.
Yeah,
I read, in Scientology, the brain is not important. Who needs one? It's just a switchboard between the mind of the being, the Thetan, and the body. And he was very dismissive, and I don't think there's an actual taboo. I've not encountered one, but you'll be laughed at if you're a Scientologist and you say that brain science has any significance. So it was with slight trepidation, not very long after leaving, that I read Oliver Sacks' The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, which is an easy mistake to make, obviously, and which was on the recommendation of my friend Mitch Beattie. And
yeah, that's Sacks is a neurologist, and the title references to the book is about various neurological conditions and what can happen with them.
That's right, and he's well known as the author of a number of books, particularly Awakenings, which was made into a film with Robin Williams and Robert De Niro, about the work he did waking up people who had been asleep for many years by using a drug called L-Dopa. And they woke up, and it's an incredible film. Though actually the Robert De Niro character in it, the one thing they took out of the film was that the joy he discovered in life and being woken up was constant masturbation. And for some reason that didn't make it. But The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat changed, I've read many things that have changed my view of life. But that was one of those revelatory books going, there can be something missing in the brain that means people don't process a certain thing. So a simple example is a lack of one side of, if you have paralysis in the body that is not acknowledged. So you would hold out a tray to somebody, they would put out only one arm to take the tray from you. And when the tray fell, they would blame you. They would not be aware that their left arm was not doing what their brain believed it was doing. And that, it made me feel a little more compassionate towards the idiots who surround us in this world. And of course, there being absolutely nothing wrong with me in any way whatsoever. I then went on to study blind spots, lacunae, as psychologists call them, because that fascinated me. But so this is not the point is, this is not something that Hubbard did deliberately. He didn't make his mind up to do this. This probably, he took a blow to the head at some point. There was a lesion in the temporal lobe. It could have been internal, but
it can be a blood clot. It can be a result of encephalitis or other diseases. It can be the result of fever, but he might have been born with it.
But he was breaking Broncos at the age of 3, as he claimed. So it's quite likely he was kicked in the head, I think.
Yeah, that very well could be.
The lesion or
The
scar in the brain, meaning that certain things are not connected anymore. So messages don't travel along
yeah.
the same route.
Well, it's not just that it's not connected. It's also the source of electrical storms, and uh, we need to say that in temporal lobe epilepsy does not necessarily come with what we call grand mal seizures. So a lot of people assume that when we hear just epilepsy manifests as those famous grand mal seizures, which is where people shake uncontrollably. They, and it's a dangerous condition. But those could be a bunch of various other types of epilepsy. Temporal lobe epilepsy doesn't necessarily come with those kind of seizures, but it can come with many other types of seizures, which can last for days at a time. Seizures are not necessarily short-lived, but they manifest differently. For example, as déjà vu, or we'll give a long list of things that they might show up as. Yeah. So let me just say a few words about our temporal lobes. We have two temporal lobes. They're named after the temples, even though they are actually located more behind the ear. So we have here on the left, we see the various lobes. There's also an insular lobe behind the temporal lobe, but that's the mysterious one. And over here on the right, we see that inside our temporal lobe, there are some midbrain organs. So let's...
They aren't actually these colors, though, right?
No. I mean, not in healthy
Artist's
people.
impression of the
Yeah.
white and gray matter.
So if this, you can see this more three-dimensionally. This is the midbrain organs, right? So these are related to what used to be referred to as the limbic system, which is related to emotions and learning, and includes the hippocampus and the amygdala, which are famous organs. And the hippocampus has to do with memory and with learning. The amygdala has to do with emotions. But those are just general. And in general, talking about functions of brain organs can be very misleading, because functions that part of the brain is related to.
Yeah, it's involved in, and there will be other parts
Yeah.
of the brain that
So all of this midbrain stuff, which includes the basal ganglia and things, that's not part of the cortex. So that's not part of any lobe.
Yep.
But as you can see in humans, it is tucked inside the temporal lobe.
Yeah.
So, and it's only in humans that the amygdala and the hippocampus are so far to the side of the brain.
Mm.
So in humans, because we're bipedal, there's a lot more emphasis on balance.
Of course.
So our balance system is those two inner ear sensors that are on the very edges of the head. And the reason they're on the edges is that so that any slight movement would be detected by them, right? So, and because the amygdala, which has to do with emotional response, needs to be very close, because any signal from the balance system, you're losing your balance, you need to immediately, or as fast as possible, to have an emotional response, and, startled and whatever fear, whatever you might feel. So the amygdalas in humans have moved into the temporal lobes, and they to be closer to the balance system. That's according to Persinger, neurologist Michael Persinger. But then so when you have a temporal lobe epilepsy, the fact that the scar is close to those midbrain structures, which are not part of the temporal lobe, but since they are located in humans in the temporal lobes, they are affected by this epilepsy.
Yes.
And in general, epilepsy, where the scar or the locus of the epilepsy, where the electrical storm starts from, we don't just need to consider what's the things in the neighborhood of that scar that are doing, but also things that are very easily accessed from that part. So if there's a big brain highway nerve system that scar might be close to the insula or close to other places. But of course, every brain is different and every epilepsy is different.
Yes.
So let's see what the actual functions of the temporal lobes or that are associated with the temporal lobe. So first of all, we have hearing, we have smelling, we have balance, we have the vestibular sense. So the vestibular sense is our sense of balance and motion. It's how we feel if we're moving, it's how we feel if we're heavy or light, or if we feel like we're floating. Those are all vestibular, our vestibular sensations. And like any other sensation, we can hallucinate a vestibular sensation. So feeling like you're floating, which can often happens as part of strong awe experiences,
Dancing.
is a it's a vestibular hallucination. Next, we have dreaming, language, literacy, emotions, which are related to the limbic system, as I mentioned, learning, various types, and assessing importance and meaning. So those are, you can see the importance of those when, if you look at people who hallucinate visually many times, or they know that what they're hallucinating is not true. When people hear voices, it's much more likely that they'll think that they're also authoritative and important and are full of meaning. And that's the connection between the temporal lobe connection between the sense of hearing and the importance assessment. Next, we have memory, visual memory, visual processing of faces, scenes, object recognition, and assessing just how meaningful what we're seeing is, or how important it is. And the connection between both this type of visual processing, because a lot of the visual stuff happens in the occipital lobe, right? No, yeah, in the back, the back of the brain lobe. And but assessment of size, which is related to the sensation of vastness and just feeling vastness, that is related to the temporal lobe. And that is also why people who with temporal lobe epilepsy can have those Alice in Wonderland sensations where they feel like they're growing and they're shrinking. So that's all the assessment of size, but related to how they feel their body is. So those are the functions of the temporal lobe, and they are related in many ways to the way awe feels for many people.
Absolutely. I mean, Hubbard referred directly to the Alice books, and also, of course, there's a list. It's quite obscure, called the list of pre-clear originations. I'm sorry, I didn't call it that. Written by Hubbard, where it's in, I think it's in the book of E-meter drills. It's one of the little E-meter pamphlets. They're probably about this thick now with the additional material, $7,000 a volume. But in there, he's got things like the colors in the room are brighter. There are 2 pages of these things that somebody might say when you are giving them a session. And they include things magnifying and getting smaller. So he was aware of that. And looking at the context of the other remarks, the pre-clear originations, they're largely things that are recorded by people who do hypnosis as responses that people have when they're in what they would call a trance.
Yeah.
Particular state of mind.
Another thing, if we look at all these various functions of the temporal lobe, there is an episode that Hubbard describes when he was under the influence of nitrous oxide at a dentist office in 1938. And if you look at most of the thing, he feels like he's floating, and he hears voices, and he hears a voice telling him survive, and it feels like it's very, very important. And he feels, and there's all this list of description of whatever type of experience he's having, and so many of them tie to the functions of the temporal lobe.
Yeah, I mean, he that was February 1938. It was extraction of wisdom teeth. He was given nitrous oxide, a hallucinogenic drug if ever there was one. and he claimed that he was dead for 8 minutes, and that during this time.
So he was certain that he was dead for 8 minutes, which is also a symptom of temporal lobe epilepsy, thinking you're dead.
Sense of certainty.
I'll tell that to anyone who's having their wisdom teeth removed. I'll kill you. Oh, sorry, so
That's
much.
quite all right. No, don't worry. Don't worry, you're going to be on TV now.
Oh, please don't. Please no.
Yeah, Spike, make sure he's in.
Oh, God.
Yeah. Or you could hit him for $100, what have you. Yeah, so he has this experience which he reckons lasted, he was told that he'd been dead for 8 minutes. That'd be how he put it. And during that time, it was revealed to him a smorgasbord, and that is the word that was used, not buffet, which would have been a lot easier. Of knowledge was shown to him. And then somebody realized he shouldn't be there, and he heard them saying, you've got to go back.
Which is a paranoid thing, right?
Yeah.
Oh, they're scheming to not show me this vast amount of information, right? So you have the feelings of knowing, you have this knowledge related stuff, you have this plot against him to not show him this stuff, we have this importance of the message to survive. And what does he do right after this dentist appointment? He goes, I think it's described that he made a pot of coffee and wrote for 2 days straight the story of Excalibur, which he was absolutely certain will change the world.
Yeah, and so many stories arose around it. We might as well drop some here while we're about it. There are 4 versions of Excalibur that I've heard of. And he was claiming, and his literary agent, Forry Ackerman, thought that it was an amusing take, that somebody who'd read it had gone mad, which wouldn't surprise me, actually. I read History of Man, so I could talk with Mike Rinder about it. And you read it? So, 90 pages. It nearly put me through the 3rd wall of fire, or whatever it is. Unbelievable. But so one of the strange things to me about this letter, which was written to his literary agent, Forry Ackerman, he wrote to him and described that event. But at that time, there's a letter from later that year, and that letter was not written at that time. It's him, Hubbard saying to his literary agent, this happened to me back then. We go into the same year, 1938, and we go to the August of that year, and he writes a letter to his first wife, and he did have a first wife, Margaret Louise Grubb Polly, who he called Skipper. And it's the famous Skipper letter, which anybody who's been in Scientology ought to read, because this is the primary material. So in August 1938, he's writing that he doesn't believe in immortality. And the theme of the Excalibur incident is that he left his body, which is an immortal act, away from dying, the mort bit, or being embodied, the corpse bit. So he, in his own mind, and at the beginning, he's, because he would come back to Excalibur as the beginning of his exploration. Yeah, then he'd sort of go, no, it was when I was 12 and I learned everything about Sigmund Freud's ideas in 4 days on a boat with a kindly naval commander, Snake Thompson. I mean, this is a man who lived in his imagination, and his imagination writ large. Any microscopic particle that went past it, but yeah. So he had this incredible supernatural experience, which left him having no belief whatsoever in spiritual being or anything like that. And he then founded a religion based upon this conflict of views, which, as you say, fits in with temporal lobe epilepsy.
Now, it could be that this event at the dentist's, that could be where he initially became epileptic, as a blood clot or something.
Or maybe the dentist just couldn't stand listening to him anymore. Side of the head.
Yeah. But it could also be that he was an epileptic and he had a somewhat smaller scar in the brain, and that event with the nitrous oxide could have maybe made it a little worse. So who knows?
Look, we know what happened when he was 3 years old and breaking Bronco.
That's right.
He was kicked in the head.
Yeah.
That's simple.
Yeah. Why not?
And then the Blackfoot wouldn't take him out on raiding parties anymore. their blood brother since the age of 2. Why did I ever believe anything about this man? Incredible, isn't it? What can you say? But you don't sit down and read the 22 biographies side by side when you're in Scientology. In fact, I think I'm the only person that's ever been foolish enough to do that. But no two of them match. No two of Hubbard's own biographies match one another. Whenever he talks about himself, every time, as far as I know, he tells a different story.
Yeah, so his autobiographies are inconsistent, but his biographies are fairly consistent.
Well, yeah. And his desire to be Simone Bolivar and Cecil Rhodes, that one's a bit of a funny one. It's got a bit of a bad rep.
Yeah.
After we talked in 2015, I went onto YouTube and found various videos posted by people with temporal lobe epilepsy showing themselves during a seizure. And with 2 of them, as I remember, you could see a slight flickering of the eyes. I think it's called nystagmus or something like that. And that was all. There was nothing else happening. And they go, see, I just had a seizure. And you go, okay. Let me add another point, which was something that fascinated me. A couple of years ago, I saw an interview with an epileptic who talked about how to not have a fit, that what they would do to ground themselves when they had experienced what in the literature called auras, which is a bit confusing, because that doesn't necessarily mean seeing colors around something. You can have an auditory aura, you can have but there is a mood, there is a change of sensation of the environment. And when he felt this coming on, he would touch things, he would look at things. And I immediately went, well, this is what's called a locational process in Scientology. I wonder if I was doing this to stop, to try and contain the seizure. So
wow,
that was interesting.
Yeah. So from what we know about first of all, this is a condition that any of us can have in the middle of our life. It is also a condition that, and because we can get it as adults, it's fairly easy to compare it to how people were before they got it. Unlike things like schizophrenia, or where even before that you were pre-schizophrenic, right? Also, temporal lobe epilepsy is not in the Diagnostics and Statistical Manual of, so the DSM of Psychiatry, which is the big Bible of psychiatry, because that book is a diagnostics manual, and epilepsy you diagnose using various ways of brain scanning.
Yeah, unlike in DSM-5, where you're guessing from a list of things, there was great argument when it came out in 2012, where people were saying, but you're putting a bunch of symptoms together. Why don't we wait until we find out what is happening neurologically? Well, it's 10 years later and we're still waiting. So it's good to have something on the guide. But
it's owing to the distinction between neurology and psychiatry, which is a historical remnant, because those are 2 different types of doctors who treat the same organ, but from different directions. And as we'll see in some of the symptoms of temporal lobe epilepsy, neurologists would say that some of the symptoms are that the psychiatrist would misdiagnose you with having some kind of a schizoaffective disorder, so schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, things and if we look at the 1968 commission by Australian government regarding the mental health of Ron Hubbard, they say that he seems schizophrenic.
He does have some Victorian Commission, the Anderson Commission.
I think so.
I think it's 1963.
Yeah. Okay, but they say that it's not schizophrenia because he's not deteriorating, and he's even though there's things that could seem like that may be psychotic, but of course in the 60s nobody heard of temporal lobe epilepsy, which was proposed in the 70s and accepted in the 80s.
Well, you did have conversation about what was called Dostoevsky syndrome before that.
Yeah, but this was not this was not consensus. These were speculations initially.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that maybe is a good segue into people who are believed to have had this condition,
Yeah.
which in some cases, you know, they're people who achieved a great deal,
and we're not horrible people.
Yeah, and yeah, there were sometimes, you know, very good people, but and Dostoevsky is a fair beginning.
So we have Dostoevsky, other writers, and as we'll see, one of the symptoms is hypergraphia, so writing a lot of text. But other writers include Edgar Allan Poe, Alfred Lord Tennyson, Gustave Flaubert, Lewis Carroll, Philip K. Dick, and the painter Vincent van Gogh, the philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, and you know, various religious figures like Jeanne d'Arc or Joan of Arc, Ellen G. White, L. Ron Hubbard. I'm certain that Ayn Rand suffered from temporal lobe epilepsy, but nobody else.
You certainly made other people suffer.
Yeah, but and you know, it's not like it explains. You know, it doesn't solve the riddle of what's going on with Scientology, but I do think it is a piece of understanding L. Ron Hubbard.
Yes, and it does take us into aspects of Scientology, I think, very directly, which we will come to.
Yeah, so I'll just say, initially, I found about it in just this book, The Neurological Basis of God Belief from 1987. And if you want to have a good, if you want to have a new idea, read an old book, as they say. And then later, because of that, I read Seized.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
I see it as mirror image, which is also very good. This is, I think, from the year 2000, and they're both very readable. And when I read Seized, I, being a Scientology follower, I'm a never-inner, but it was hit me in the middle of reading it. Wait a minute, L. Ron Hubbard, this is, you know. And then I looked and looked. I was sure that someone would have said something about it, and it turned out that nobody has. So.
And not even me. And I'd spent time with psychiatrists. Obviously, I should have gone to the neurologists and got Hubbard's brain and tested it. But I talked with Louis Jolyon West about Hubbard. He started his study of Hubbard in 1951. And so, you know, as a world famous psychiatrist who people say worked for the dark side of the force. I'm not aware of that from my meetings with him. For example, there was a thing going around about him telling them what to do, the ATF and the FBI, what to do at Waco. Now, I was with him that week, so I know what he was doing that week. He was cursing about them not listening to his advice, being nice to them. So, you know, who knows? He also killed an elephant with LSD, and I'm guessing there aren't many people who can claim that. And his excuse is that he didn't know that giving LSD to an elephant would kill it. He knew that if you gave it to spiders, they'd spin symmetrical webs, but you know, who was to know? Let's talk about the one characteristic that can't be argued with, and that is hypergraphia, the urge to write. And the proof of that is the Guinness Book of World Records, which lists L. Ron Hubbard as the most prolific author in all history. So, hypergraphia. Even though, of course, many of the works that would have been presented to them were transcripts of lectures, in fact. So,
yes, but so with the hypergraphia, the first of all, this is one of the 18 personality traits described by Bear and Fedio in the Bear Fedio inventory. So hypergraphia, if the person, it depends on which side of your brain the scar is, whether, because only one side of our brain is the one that knows how to read and write.
Which is usually, in a right-handed person, is generally the left hand side of the brain.
So, but in people who are illiterate, And in people whose epileptic center is on the non-writing side of their brain, we might see people who draw a lot, like Vincent van Gogh, or we see people who who talk endlessly, but the talk is to people who listen, right? So you can write at home an endless amount of text, thinking that there will be an audience to it later. So people like Søren Kierkegaard, when he passed away, they found mountains of text. But with people like Hubbard and also, you know, Martin Luther, who might have had an inner ear infection that manifests as temporal lobe epilepsy, they might give endless lectures that are just that never end. And Hubbard, on top of his world record-setting number of published works, he wrote 500,000 pages for Scientology, which are not the published works. So,
yeah, there are hundreds and hundreds of stories, and I talked with my dear friend Ari Chalef, who worked with Hubbard closely, and this a few years ago, and I said, you know, he was fat and lazy and extremely rude, and I said, no, he wasn't lazy. You could walk past his cabin very quietly on the ship, the cattle ferry, the Apollo, and he would be scribbling. There'd be more and more. And when you just look at the shelf of his policy letters, his executive directives, his technical bulletins, you know, volume after volume. I have about 10-foot shelf, which is Ron Hubbard books. That's outside of the 3,000 to 3,500 recorded lectures. So he was somebody who was either writing or talking much of the time.
Yes, and Scientology today, if you know, if you ask them, or you know, this was their last speaker, Tommy. Anyway, he said that there's two options: either Hubbard was a con man, or he was not a con man. And if he was a con man, then it doesn't make sense that he would put so much effort writing, as I said, hundreds of thousands of pages of work towards Scientology. Con men don't do that. They are there to make their money, to manipulate people, and to enjoy the money. They're not there to put in endless hours. Therefore, the conclusion is that he was not a con man. But I would like to add a third option, that this was just a symptom of a neurological condition. So
it was a compulsion. He was driven to
yeah, and it's you're so emotionally from what I heard, and I know a couple of temporal lobe epileptics, the writing just calms you down. So as long as you're writing, first of all, you can do it for hours on end, but it keeps your emotions sort of in check. So you're not you're not on the emotional roller coaster that you normally are in this kind of neurological condition.
Yeah, and to point out that again, you can have hypergraphia and be a very useful and contributing member to society. The example springs to mind is Alexander von Humboldt, who was one of the great contributors to humanity. Darwin's work comes out of Humboldt. There are more rivers, mountains, animals, insects, plants named after Humboldt than anybody else because of his incredible work.
He gave us the concept of energy.
There you go. He had plenty of it. But it's said of Humboldt that, you know, people travel from all over the Americas and Europe to meet him, and nobody could ever get a word in edgewise. He just there was just a torrent of information pouring out of him. So not necessarily a bad thing. The other thing is that, sorry.
Oh, so the with Hubbard, I mean, assuming that he became epileptic at some point in his life, and I think that there's evidence as early as 38, but he could have had it before. But his pathological lying, narcissism, and other negative personality traits or personality disorders, those are in addition to the temporal lobe epilepsy. They're not part of the epilepsy.
Yeah, you want to make sure that we're not painting everybody who has this condition into being Vincent van Gogh. I will take the Hypergraphia 11 years earlier than you. I'll take it to 1927, when I have the diaries, and I think I'm the only person who has them, just by strange chance of fate. But I have 2 handwritten diaries of Hubbard's from the 2 trips he made to China. And he is writing every day, he's writing things down. When he gets home, he actually types up and glorifies the information in his diary, which fascinated me, that even as a 16-year-old, he was doing this. So yes, he's writing from his teens, at least. So, and that's what he then, when he's before he's kicked out of George Washington University, he's writing for the University Hatchet, the newspaper. And again, it's rambling. It's just saying things, and some of which were very useful to me later on, because, for example, the Caribbean motion picture expedition, which Scientology says he performed, he is the person who wrote the description of its failure for the University Hatchet, and how they'd not actually shot any film, not done anything. So he was perpetually writing, right from his teens and on through the rest of his life. And talking, to get close to the end of his life, I on a number of occasions spoke with Robert Vaughan Young, and Ron was the man who edited Mission Earth for publication, and the look on his face when he talked about having to this job given to him by Hubbard. Hubbard only ever did a single draft of things. Ryder Haggard is the only other writer I know of who didn't bother to reread what he'd written, and so it's very scrappy. And he didn't actually write 10 books that became Mission Earth. He wrote a book that is 5,000 pages long, and Paul Vaughan had to work out how to chop it up, and it did a great deal of work on it. So I think that's interesting. That's something that fascinated me, that he wouldn't revisit things. And so Scientology is absolutely littered with contradictions. On one day he's saying you never repay the money to people, and then he's saying you always repay the money to people if they ask for it. And it just, within days he can be switching his opinion. There's one it's a little bit technical, but for anybody who's done the solo auditors course, where you learn how to do this to yourself on the upper levels, there are 2 bulletins, and bulletins are red ink on white paper, if he wrote them. And one of them says, some idiot has introduced the idea that you only ever call a floating needle on the E-meter when it is between 2 and 3.5 on the tone arm. So that's now confused the heck out of anybody listening. But some idiot has done this. The next bulletin is the one where he tells you to do it. And so, I must say that I read those 2 things side by side and didn't notice part of the double bind you get into in Scientology. And then again, same person, Mitch Beattie, pointed it out to me. He's saying somebody's an idiot for doing this, and then you find it was him that did it. And so there's something about his memory, there's something about his self-perception that is different to other people. And part of that is an outpouring. Finally, on that point, I think it's in Dianetics, the original thesis, which purports to be a manuscript written before his book, Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health. My understanding is it was written afterwards, but that's another story. But in there, he talks about his research methods. I think it's there. It could be in Dianetics, Evolution of a Science. He was really working it to get some more text out of there, where he talks about using automatic writing as a method of research. And that's something that people need to understand. Very popular among spiritualists and in the that community from the 19th into the 20th century, the idea of being possessed by somebody and writing. So I have this sense of him. He wasn't necessarily even particularly cognizant of what he was writing. He was just writing. That, as you say, would relieve the pressure, would relieve the tension that he felt, because it's quite evident, and we'll get to that, the other characteristic, that he was pretty much on edge most of the time. You know, he had to do something to try and calm himself down. And drugs and alcohol played some part in that. But
so there's two lists of different symptoms. So there's the personality traits, which are the 18 Bear and Fedio ones, and then there's different seizure symptoms. Do you want to start with the Bear Fedio traits, or?
I think the seizure symptoms, because we're there looking at something that we have evidence of. We don't really have to necessarily interpret. When we were at Toronto, Hannah Whitfield talked about him giving lectures, and of course there are a few filmed lectures, but most of them are recordings, just audio recordings, tape recordings. And she talked about him throwing his arm up after he'd started a lecture. There was this almost involuntary movement, and that brings us into the seizure.
Okay, so I'm reading, this is from page 99 of Seized. I'll start. Since seizures are composed of ordinary mental states, they can take almost any form. According to Paul Spires, TLE seizures cover all the categories of human existence and processing of the environment. To lend order to the multiplicity of seizure symptoms, Spires has divided them into 6 categories, which he identifies as hallucinatory, emotional, autonomic, referring to bodily functions outside of conscious control, motor, sensory, and experiential. Let me pause here to say that of these long list of symptoms, you get a certain set of them, and those are the ones that you always have. So these are not, you would not normally change between these. So
and you won't necessarily have every symptom, but you'll have a set of
absolutely not.
They'll be repeated over the years.
Hallucinatory seizure symptoms consist of taste, smells, sounds, voices, and visions of color, lights, or menacing figures. So let's take a pause here. And I know that he hallucinated smells, right? He would say that there was scented ink in something, right? And he would have things washed a number of times in scentless, right?
There is people who were in the crew around him, Sea Organization members, had to do a course called the hygiene hat, a hat being a training course. And in the hygiene hat, it says that they are forbidden from to wear any scented products. So they couldn't have scented shampoo or soap, because Hubbard was highly sensitive to these things. His apartments had to be decorated with odorless paint. When Jerry Armstrong was building a domicile for him, which he never inhabited, they had to use a lining of, I think it's called visqueen in the US, plastic, to seal it off so that scents couldn't get in. Rajneesh, of course, had sniffers, so you couldn't go into the room if there was any scent on you. So it's curious, this hypersensitivity. And it would
not just sensitivity, but also hallucinating, where you say there is a smell when there isn't.
Exactly. And the story we were told at Toronto by Jesse Prince, who was tremendously amusing. I thought he was wonderful.
Yeah, it was great.
He was assigned a job where he had to send the boxes and boxes of weekly statistics to Hubbard, because Hubbard wanted to check every organization and make sure it was doing what it meant to do. And Jesse said that as he was at the time quite a heavy smoker, he had virtually no sense of smell. And he knew that David Miscavige had assigned him this job because Hubbard would blow up over it, because he always did. And Jesse decided that what he would do was just send the boxes on. He wouldn't sign the release saying he'd seen them. And he got a commendation back from Hubbard saying that he'd understood that the ink in the pens contained rose perfume, which is what the psychiatrists are using to control us all. So, yeah, the hallucination, and there are, menacing figures is the last part of that.
Yeah.
When Virginia Downsborough, he summoned her to Gran Canaria in 1966 to rescue him, and I interviewed her twice, and she still thoroughly believed in Scientology. In fact, this was when he was doing the famous Xenu and the Body Thetans, the thing about 75 million years ago, where we got pulled from however many planets and dropped in volcanoes and blown up. And she said that, and she was, the first time I interviewed her, she had people studying this course in the next room. So she still absolutely believed. But she said that he was terrified that the discarnate spirits, little demons, the body thetans, were going to take him over. And we read, and I said I wasn't going to mention this, we read in Lawrence Wright that he interviewed Sarge Fouth, who was with Hubbard at the end, and Hubbard told him that the body thetans were taking over. So there was this sense of something around him. In 1949, he was down in Savannah, Georgia, with his friend Major Arthur Burks in the Marines. And Burks, in his autobiography, Monitors, talks about Hubbard seeing the little its, these little beings jumping over his fingers and things like this. And Burks believed in them, but he'd never seen one. Hubbard actually perceived these things. He also said that Hubbard had, when he'd been a glider pilot, a barnstorming pilot called Flash, according to his own accounts, when he was at university, that he'd never been frightened. Because when he looked out on the wing of the plane, the Empress, who is his guardian angel, holy guardian angel, was always out there on the wing, dressed in her green garb and with her long flowing red hair. So yes, he hallucinated.
Yeah.
And
wow.
It was often menacing.
Okay, let's see. The next are emotional symptoms, span the spectrum of human emotional states, including attacks of panic or anger, explosions of tears or laughter, and orgasm.
Oh.
Yeah.
I wonder if anybody's got any of his old underpants, so you could check that.
Yeah, and we'll get to the emotional things later in the personality traits. So let's get to physical states such as irregular heartbeat, shortness of breath, dizziness, flushing, and vomiting are among the autonomic symptoms. Do you know about?
He was asthmatic, so certainly shortness of breath would be
okay.
a problem for him.
Next, we have lip smacking.
Yes,
undressing and yeah. I heard that he did that. Undressing in public, staring, twitching, and transient paralysis are some of the motor seizure symptoms, as are Jacksonian seizures.
Staring was something that he made us all do. You had to.
That's right.
For some hours, and Scientologists get upset if you call it staring. They call it confronting. But yeah, that behavior was externalized towards others.
So the next are Jacksonian seizures, named in honor of Jackson by Freud's teacher Charcot, which consist of tremors spreading up and down one side of the body. So next we have sensory seizure symptoms include pain and the temporary inability to feel pain, and paresthesias, bizarre feelings that patients report during seizures, such as pins and needles, bugs crawling under the skin, and the sensation that a limb has been lost.
I mean, the particular one that he complained about from 1944 and well into the 50s was what he would call terror stomach, that he experienced pain. He was a year in Oak Knoll Hospital at the end of the war, fundamentally, as far as I can tell, avoiding being sent to Japan and the occupying forces, which he was briefly trained to do. And as the Japanese were fighting to the death, I think he went off the idea. But he claimed, it was claimed that he had ulcers and he was treated for ulcers. But when you look into the medical reports, nothing was found on X-ray. There were no ulcer craters. So it may well be that, you know, this is the pain. You know, he also had bursitis, I think, in his right shoulder, where the bursa doesn't lubricate between the muscle and the bone.
Next, we have the Alice in Wonderland symptoms, in which object seems to contract or expand, or the person seems to be falling down a hole. And even memories of sensations, such as of an arm being submerged in icy water. The final category, experiential symptoms, cover such altercations of consciousness as dreamy states, flashbacks, trances, automatisms, déjà and jamais vu, the sense that time is standing still or rushing by, the illusion of a presence, a doppelganger or a double, such as Dostoevsky described in his short novel, The Double, the feeling of being possessed, and mind-body dissociation or depersonalization, in which the mind seems to separate from the body.
All right, go back one to the feeling of being possessed. Given that Scientology and then depersonalization, Scientology is based on a very few number of premises. There are 2,000 techniques or auditing procedures, processes, but they have a very limited number. So the sense of being possessed, of course, the upper levels of Scientology, from operating Thetan level 3 through 4, 5, 6, and 7, are all about possession. They're all about trying to get rid of what he'd call body Thetans, beings, Thetans attached to your body. So possession was a major aspect of his belief system. Depersonalization, when I first read a definition of depersonalization a long time ago, it quite floored me, because the goal of Scientology is depersonalization. The idea is to get out of your mind. And I have seen a few Scientologists who've achieved that. To get out of your head, to be 3 feet behind your head. And, you know, when I read that this is considered a psychiatric condition, and I then, in reading up about it, I interviewed quite a lot of Scientologists, because exteriorization with full perception is the goal of Scientology. That's what the 8th OT level was said to achieve, that you'd be able to move out of your body at will and travel anywhere you liked in the universe. So that's what people are trying to do. No, that's not true. I've met one person and interviewed one person who said that she had experienced this, you know, leaving her body and flying out over the rooftops. But that was before she got into Scientology. She didn't have the experience again. What Scientologists usually talk about is the sensation of being outside of their bodies, often feeling that they're sort of slightly behind their head, but the perception is still through the eyes, or possibly the little gold discs in front of the eyes, according to Hubbard's earlier work in the 1950s. And that is taken to be a very positive thing. But I, quite early on in Scientology, a man came into the Birmingham mission covered in bandages, and he was absolutely exuberant. The day before, he had walked through a plate glass window, and he said, "I was exterior." You know, it's like, well, if that's what happens when you're exterior, I'm not keen on it.
He should just have his Thetan go through the plate glass.
Well, you see, it is
window,
Thetan. The Thetan is the being himself.
Yeah, there you go.
An interesting one, that we talk about having a brain rather than being a brain. We talk about having thoughts in our mind as if these are separable things. So Hubbard had caught on to something, but
Hubbard did think that he had a doppelganger. This was Bruce Hines pointed out to me, that there is a point where Hubbard tells a story of he has some Hispanic name or Spanish name, his doppelganger, but which is a really weird thing to believe.
Yeah,
but yeah,
it would
that was
explain
part of
lots of the contradictions in his stories as to which one of them it was. One of
yeah.
them was crippled and blind at the end of World War II, according to my philosophy, 65. And another of them was down in Los Angeles beating up 3 petty officers on the 25th of July, according to an professional auditor's bulletin called Communication and Isness from, I think, 57. And that was explained to me by a believing Scientologist when I said, look, there's this contradiction. He had 2 bodies. So there you go. Maybe he had 3 bodies. We may never know.
Okay, so let's move on to the Bear Fedio inventory traits. Yes. So these are personality traits, and they're called characteristics attributed to interictal behavior in TLE, and interictal means between seizures. Okay, so let's start. There's a number of them fall under the category of the first one is emotionality, and we'll do the order of the original Bear Fedio, right? You have a different order.
Yeah.
So emotionality, and then in addition to emotionality, we have which is the deepening of all emotions, sustained intense affect, but there's also elation, euphoria. Another one is sadness, anger, aggression, and then the next one is guilt. I guess that will be. So let's start with emotionality. In general, it seems like he was a very intensely emotional person.
Yes, given to tremendous rages in which he would give severe reality adjustments, SRAs, something I only learned about in the last year I was involved. And one of the things that bothered me when, indeed, my friend Ira Chalef had a little bit of he was working for me. He was on the leave from the Sea Organization. He'd been the commanding officer at St. Hill. He'd been an Ron Hubbard aide, all this sort of stuff. And so he worked for me in my little artist agency. And one day he really tore a strip off my wife. And I found it hard to believe because he is the most gentle and empathetic of people. And next time I saw him 3 days later, I said, why did you do that? And where's it written that you do that? Because everything in Scientology is, if it isn't written, it isn't true. And he said, it's not written anywhere. I said, well, why did you do it then? And he went, and he said, Hubbard did it to us. Since then, I have interviewed tens of people who witnessed these incredible rages, this, just blazing rages. And he would come right up to somebody, which must have been unpleasant because his teeth were rotting in his head because he was terrified of dentists. So he didn't smell good. And he would tell them that they were destroying all of humanity. They were a worthless creep or what have you. And for me, there's this incredible contradiction. I gave the world Dianetics to relieve trauma, and here I am inducing it in people on a daily basis. That didn't work for me. So yeah, really bad temper, but also he'd be hypermanic. He'd get very happy about things. And Althea Hart, who is, I think, still credited in Scientology 8.80, all of the later Hubbard books, despite his hypergraphia, the books after Dianetics and Modern Science and Mental Health are all compilations. They're all things that somebody else put together from his notes, or more usually from his lectures. After Hart left in 1954, he started a wonderful magazine. It was all online the last time I looked, which is a few years ago. It's called the Aberree. And lots of people, as they left Hubbard, contributed to this. Many of the famous names contributed to this. Art Coulter and Don Purcell, A. Van Vogt, the science fiction writer, the former science fiction writer. He didn't write another word after getting involved with Hubbard's Dianetics, very sadly. And in one article called "This Is It," Althea Hart said, Hubbard should label his discoveries that every 6 months he finally finds out what is the fundamental problem. This is it. And that exuberance with which he's saying, I finally got there. I found the thing, that the magic bullet that will crack all cases, that will solve everything. And he seems completely unaware that he keeps saying this. And if you look at Scientology in depth, what you're being taught as the bridge now was devised in the 1960s. If you look back into the 1950s, there are all kinds of wacky directions that he went off in. And he'll later say, I think it's in technical degrades, everything's relevant. That being so, you have to learn about the rock, which is the basic thing that's wrong with you. You have to learn about goals, problems, masses, which is the basic. You have to learn about basic, which was the first basic thing in Dianetics. He keeps discovering the solution to all the problems of humanity, and it never works. But he gets very happy about it. Then talking about the depressed end of his emotions, Barbara Snyder, who was his girlfriend during the second marriage, you know, the one that he never had, to Sarah Hollister, Sarah Northrup. Barbara Cloden and he lived in an apartment in LA. She would later qualify as a psychologist. And she said that he would just lie there in bed day after day, drinking a bottle of scotch a day, and complaining about being worthless and not having anything else to say and not being able to come up with anything else. This is in the interlude that would lead, through a bottle of rum a day, to Science of Survival. John McMaster, the world's first real clear in 1965, he was very confused when Hubbard chose him to be a clear. I interviewed him at 6 hours, a recorded interview with John. And he said that after he'd had a particularly good reception at a talk, he'd go to see Hubbard, and Hubbard would be sat in his office crying. He might even be sat in the corner crying because of the adulation that John was receiving, which he thought he deserved. So in 1950, in 1965, you then look at Jim Dinkelsey's description of his, he calls it a debrief, of the time that he and a bodyguard looked after Hubbard. There were just the three of them in an apartment in Queens, New York, late 72, early 73. And again, you see a pretty morose character. And then on to Sarge Fouth at the end of his life, where he's saying, I failed, I'm nothing, I'm useless. So you have rage, you have elation, and you have sadness. And they're all extremes of effect. They're not normal happiness or normal unhappiness.
Yeah. And aggression as well, of course.
Well, a horrible aggression, throwing people overboard, and I think you really have to stop and think about what he was doing. That, you know, when Gordon Melton and others of these, James Lewis, these people who, I don't know why they take the opinion they do and why they don't study a bit further. But let's take the specific of overboarding. Did L. Ron Hubbard have people thrown overboard from his ships? And the answer is yes, he did. The proof is a magazine published by Scientology called The Auditor. It's in issue number 41. And in the middle, there are copies in the Library of Congress. There are copies in the British Library. There's a copy in my house. There are copies online. In the middle is a double-page spread of photographs of overboarding. There's one specific photograph of somebody being hoisted up to be bequeathed to the deep. And at the bottom it says photo credit L. Ron Hubbard. So yes, he knew about it. And these people, this is much higher than the high diving board at a swimming pool. It's about 10 feet higher as far as I can make out. So they're being hurled overboard, sometimes with their ankles tied for non-swimmers and a rope so they could be pulled back up. And I interviewed Karen de la Carrière, one of the only 8 people trained to the highest level in Scientology, the class 12 case supervisor. And she said, yes, when we were off Corfu, you've got to get, all of the ships would discharge their effluent, their sewage into the water. So people were being thrown into this. I was told that, I think it was Joe van Staten, who was actually thrown into the water when there were logs floating around the ship. So in terms of aggressiveness, this is fairly extreme. Charlie Riesdorf, whose kids became messengers, he and somebody else, and if anybody watching knows the name of the somebody else, I'd be curious, were ordered by Hubbard to push a peanut around the deck, the wooden splintery deck of the Apollo, with their noses all the way around. A ship housing several hundred people, so a cattle ferry. And with the crew watching, so there's not just aggressiveness there, there's sadism.
Yeah. Okay. So the next personality trait that we have here is altered sexual interest, described as loss of libido, hyposexualism, fetishism, transvestism, exhibitionism, hypersexual episodes. So, from my understanding, L. Ron Hubbard does not rape as many women as you would expect, or people who, there's certain naive evolutionary psychologists who would say that, cult leaders are all about impregnating as many women, or it's silly, and in this case wrong, because it does seem like he had reduced sexual libido, right?
Yeah, there's, I mean, Mao Zedong would probably be, or Genghis Khan, they're the two great sexual predators. Mao Zedong passed on venereal diseases to a woman a day. Mussolini was reckoned to be raping perhaps 4 women a day. But the rape was largely physically brutal, that they would be hurt, and it would be a 10-minute interlude. Gaddafi, of course, is the other horrifically famous person who's sexually, had a dungeon in which I think one woman was kept for 8 years. Truly terrible people. Hubbard's sexual behavior, John McMaster told me that when he traveled the world giving lectures, there were quite a number of little red-headed babies. So he was very much convinced that Hubbard was spreading his seed. I think there's a period in the 1960s, mid-60s, where he perhaps becomes impotent, suffers erectile dysfunction. There's a peculiar affidavit by a woman called Anne Bailey. Ben Corridon, when he was, just before he published Messiah or Madman, and claimed it was co-authored by L. Ron Hubbard Jr., which it wasn't. But he said that he had based everything in his book on this one affidavit by Anne Bailey. And he said, what did I think of it? And I said, well, I don't find it credible. But she claimed that in the late 1970s, she was taken to a building in Los Angeles where this old man with ragged red hair came in and lay on top of her, and he was not able to get an erection. So, that one's a story that's off the edge. There are stories, and I tend to believe them. In researching the history of anything, you have to look at the context in which something is said. Does it fit in with the other things you know? And the work of L. Ron Hubbard Jr., commonly known as Nibs, is usually dismissed by authors because Nibs signed statements saying that he'd perjured himself. Now, there are 2 things about that that are important to know. The first is Nibs was harassed more severely than anyone else by the Guardian's office. Nibs had to keep a gun with him because he was under such threat. He was also, he ended up working as a janitor by the time I was interviewing him in 1984, near the end of his life. That was the job he'd got. He hadn't done well. He'd got 6 kids. And so when they came along and said, look, we'll give you $400,000 if you'll sign this statement, I think that might have been quite an inducement. And that's indeed why he didn't co-author, having signed a contract with Ben Corridon to write a book. That's why he didn't, because he was paid off. There's a manuscript which has still not been published, and I would love it to be published. I do have a copy of it. I was told I had the 6th copy in the world. It's like Hubbard's Excalibur, it's that rare, called The Telling of Me by Me. And it's the last thing that Nibs Hubbard wrote. And so there's an earlier manuscript which is partially incorporated in it, which Paulette Cooper helped him to work on. I think it's called 1/10% of Scientology or something. And there are crazy stories in these manuscripts. If you pare them down and say, this is what his father told him, like, I am the beast, 666, and Nibs believed it. I should say Nibs was born in 1934 to Hubbard's first wife, Margaret Louise Grubb, commonly known as Polly or Skipper. He was abandoned completely. He and his sister, Catherine, who would later be Catherine Gillespie, their father stopped paying any child support towards them when he went off to war in 1941, and had pretty much nothing to do with them. So when Nibs got to be 18, the thing he most wanted in the world, as many abandoned children will want, was to spend time with his father. And so he went and found his father in 1952, was given a handful of amphetamines and told to recall his past lives, and therefore contributed to the history of man, Scientology History of Man, or What to Audit, which is a cold-blooded and factual account of your last 60 trillion years, or 73 trillion years, or 76 trillion years, depending where in the 90-page manuscript you take the date from. Miscavige has corrected it, so it all says the same thing, but the original has 3 rather different dates. And he then spent the next 7 years as his father's deputy and henchman. And he describes a sexual practice which, by looking at the context and the information around, I believe is probably true. Many women would be sexually available to him. He was a celebrity. And what Nibs said they would do together was to take such a woman and give her a cocktail of 2 counter-indicated drugs. So a barbiturate, a downer, and an amphetamine, an upper. This is the possibly ultimate date rape drug, because you can create an amnesiac state in the person. And he said that what his father liked to do was to strip women down once they were in this groggy state, tie them up and cut them with a blade. So I had to struggle for a long time after I first read that, going, how does that fit in? And then gradually finding out, Hubbard admitted to and recommended amphetamine use. If you have to grab hold of anything, grab hold of Benzedrine, to quote him. I wrote a paper called Never Believe a Hypnotist, which is a quotation from Ron Hubbard, who admitted to being a hypnotist, so shouldn't believe him. Mm-hmm. He also, in a lecture which is referenced in that paper and published by Scientology, talked about having made himself a guinea pig on an experiment where he became addicted to phenobarbital, barbiturate drug. His medical records from the Veterans Administration and the Navy show that he was prescribed phenobarbital, and which was the drug, in fact, being used by the people who are using abreaction therapy, like William Sargent in the UK and Brinker and Spiegel in the US, things he may very well have read in the Oak Knoll Library. So he was taking the drug that was used for that. So we have those 2 drugs. They were a part of what he was doing. Virginia Downsborough, who rescued him from Gran Canaria in late 1966, said he wasn't eating anymore. He was taking a shelf load of drugs. And tantalizingly, in my last conversation with David Mayo in 2013, he told me she'd told him what the drugs were, but I was not able to pry it out of him. So that has gone to the grave with David, I'm afraid.
Wow.
But so the use of these drugs, the induction of states, and this possible really extreme sexual perversion, it's possible. It's certainly possible.
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly under the category of altered sexual interest. And also we need to remember that not all of these traits need to manifest, only some of them.
Yeah.
Okay, next we have
lip smacking. That was all I needed.
next we have guilt, which is described as tendency for self-scrutiny and self-recrimination. That's part of the sadness, right? That we discussed earlier.
Him feeling guilty that, as we Serge felt at the end of his life, Serge felt that he's let people down, and and he certainly had. It fascinates, what an incredible personality. I'm sure that it's what's kept you busy with Scientology. Jim Beverly, who was a professor of ethics and Christian thought, I think was his actual job. And he's written about 20 books now. When he was luring me to go to Canada to do the seminar, he said that the most interesting subject in the world was Scientology. There was nothing like it. But his agent kept making him write another book about Islam or what have you. But, he'd written about the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Moonies and what have you, but nothing. And it's true. It's the most incredible story and it's remarkable. So here we still are. It's 39 years since I left Scientology, and I'm still doing this.
Next, we got hypermoralism, which is described as attention to rules with inability to distinguish significant from minor infractions and desire to punish offenders.
Yeah.
So that's fairly clear.
Yeah, here's somebody who made a vast set of rules, varying from, how to put flowers in a vase or vase, as he would have said it, and making sure you don't knock the vase against the faucet, which those of us in Britain had to look up. It means what we call a tap, through which water comes, down to the layout of the car park at St. Hill. That's in, I think, volume 7 of the Organization Executive Course. Every little detail, the rules that you'd got to follow, and any infraction. When he was practicing overboarding in 1968 in Corfu, if you were 1 minute late for course, you needed to take your wristwatch and your shoes off and get ready for it. So and very much setting rules for other people. So Scientologists are they're allowed to drink alcohol, which, as he said in Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health, is the most dangerous drug. In there, he says cannabis is relatively harmless. But you're allowed to drink alcohol. You're allowed to smoke cigarettes, which I'm led to believe can be quite dangerous. But you are not allowed to take any street drug. This having, of course, in the past recommended amphetamines as a way of enhancing the auditing experience. So all sorts of, and then the rules changed that Scientology, talking about the sexual aspect of it, in the late 60s, there are a variety of orgiastic accounts. Again, in the 1970s, the Manchester organization, in 68, the Los Angeles organization, that there were things happening. And then you get a point where if you hold hands with somebody, you've got to marry them. If you're in this organization, it becomes you can't kiss somebody outside of being married. So it becomes, and these rules were not imposed outward to the rank and file like myself, but there were strict rules about what you couldn't do. And if you broke one of those rules, you could be sent to the Rehabilitation Project Force, where you would very likely spend 2 years being thought reformed. Let's use Lifton's term. So hypermoralism, absolutely.
And which manifests also as black and white thinking, which is typical of many cultic groups.
And polarization, the binary effect, and Scientology is built upon the notion of a two-terminal universe, which is a ridiculous idea. He takes the idea of electromagnetism, positive and negative, cathode, anode, and says, well, that's how everything works. And it runs through Scientology that, there really aren't many shades of gray. and I don't mean that in the sexual sense.
Mhm.
You have like the Gold's Problems Mass, which used to be the old release grade 6, the clearing course, the old OT1 and OT2. I did it as OT2, operating Thetan level 2, where you basically are told that you're implanted in an implant station, and apparently they're still out there, with the thought to be or not to be, and you get a little flash and an electric shock. But everything is divided down into it's a 2-terminal universe, a binary universe. So it becomes explicit in the technology. And let me say at this point that I long ago came to the conclusion that Scientology was the externalization of L. Ron Hubbard's temperament. That he wanted the world to be the way he was inside, and he wanted to try and cure himself somehow, heal himself, which I think he probably failed to do, all in all.
Yeah.
Or I wouldn't be saying this, because he would have achieved the power to stop me,
Yeah. Well, wait until he returns, right? Any minute now.
Well, no, you're at 21 years leave from this organization, so 2007.
Yeah.
It could be, of course, that David Miscavige had him drowned at birth. And that would be another 21 years.
I wouldn't put it past him. So next we have obsessionalism, described as ritualism, orderliness, compulsive attention to detail.
Yeah.
So that's also fairly clear cut.
It's true, but for those who are not familiar, this is kind of micro control. When Homer Schomer gave testimony at the Christopherson Tichborne case, having been an executive in Scientology on the ship, he said that one of the things that startled him was that Hubbard would look at the daily menus for the crew. And I kind of came away from this, so everything is controlled. Jesse Prince had boxes and boxes of statistics that everything is being observed. But the thing with the menus that got me is, well, so that would be one day it would be rice and beans, and the other day it would be beans and rice. What was the problem there? But yes, that control, how you put flowers in a vase, how you clean windows, you rub dirty newspaper over. I'd just like to point out to any Scientologists, believers who are watching, oil-based inks, if you rub them on the newspaper on the window, will make it turn black. Water-based inks, you might find that they'll clean some. You have to check that. And he didn't get down far enough into the nature of inks, I don't think, on that particular case. But yeah,
so
the Dutch have a phrase which is rude, which is ant fucking. We call it splitting hairs. And everything is taken apart in this fine detail, but to the point where it's not, in fact, in the least bit useful. It's just externalization of his temperament.
So the next one or two, we can put them together, is circumstantiality, which is described as loquacious, pedantic, overly detailed, and peripheral.
And viscosity.
And viscosity, which is described as stickiness and tendency to repetition. With both of those are described as, if you walk around town and you meet a cult member that tries to convince you to join their cult, many people would try to avoid that interaction because they'll be afraid that they would not be able to get rid of this person, because as a cult member, they and this is part of what they describe as viscosity or stickiness, that they don't understand conversational cues about changing the subjects or about ending the conversations. And with their circumstantiality, they just cling to very detail that misses the bigger picture.
Yeah, and as it says, there's repetition, and
repetition, which of course, if you ask someone do birds fly 700 times an hour for hours straight, do fish swim, you'll see tendency for repetition might be familiar.
And there are many procedures where you will just ask a small number of questions. You know, the infamous opening procedure by duplication, or opero by dupe, as it's called by Scientology. I always like that dupe part of it, where you have a little card table at either end of a room. One has a book on it, the other has a bottle on it, and the auditor, the counselor, guides, you know, look at that book, thank you, walk over to that book, thank you, pick the book up, thank you, what's its color, and then back to the bottle, what's it, I think you vary between color and temperature, but that's it. You just backwards and forwards.
You repeat that for hours on end.
Well, you'll quite usually do a 2-hour session. I very early on in my career in Scientology, in the first year when I was training on this, I gave a guy 5 sessions, 2 hours long, doing this. And by, you know, talking about depersonalization, and that's what you're meant to achieve, of course. You're meant to be out of your head. By the time we were done, I'd been out there, you know, for about 9.5 hours. It was just the most boring, monotonous, repetitious thing I'd ever done. That's one of a number of procedures. And of course, the processes, pretty much all of the processes, you go through the same ritual. You repeat, and you must use, you know, we were talking about attention to detail. You have to use exactly the same words. It is rote. It is, you know, even down to, you know, when somebody's faltered a little bit in describing something to them, you say, okay, continue. You know, that it's, I had the fortune, whether good or bad, of receiving counselling from the top counsellor in the United Kingdom, Richard Rees. Bill Clinton says he went to Oxford with the Scientologists, so Scientology can't be so bad. But then he didn't inhale any of the cannabis brownies he was eating either. And that Scientologist was Richard Rees, who was indeed at Oxford. And in the morning, there were only 2 people he was counselling. He was the head of all counselling in the UK. And one of them was Van Morrison in the morning, and the other was me in the afternoon, because I'd complained about the, you know, I'm on the highest level that can be delivered in the United Kingdom, operating level 5. And the guy who's doing it smells, and he can't work out how to open the window. I mean, he's an OT5, but he can't work that out. And in the end, I got tired of this and complained. And so I was assigned to Richard Rees. And I'd been in Scientology for 7-8 years. And it was startling how wooden he appeared. You know, that he was completely without effect. You know, his training routine 0 was just really quite frightening. And you would get this completely emotionless repetition of these set stock phrases. And I say, about 2,000 procedures in Scientology, they all have an exact wording, and you must not deviate from that wording. You know, which if you look at other forms of therapy, if you look at, say, Carl Rogers' person-centered, this would be absolute anathema to them. The idea of staring at somebody, the idea of, you know, giving them what Hubbard calls commands. These aren't questions, they're commands, where you are controlling the person into responding. So yeah, it started to make me think about magical ceremonies and church services and things that are always done in this way and that induce this state. And I started to, long ago, to think that if we thought about Scientology as being hypnotic, it differed from ordinary hypnotherapy in that it wasn't just the person receiving it that went into a trance state. Because you're repeating it and going through this, you also will start to probably feel a little bit spaced out and dizzy and maybe euphoric as a consequence of going into a reverie state, a word that was used quite openly in 1950, but it's used by hypnotists to mean a light trance state, which is achieved through repetition, also found in advertising, of course. You know, just keep saying it.
Yeah. All right. The next one is sense of personal destiny.
Oh, I've
Events
got
given
nothing on that.
events given highly charged personalized significance, divine guidance ascribed to many features of patient's life.
Well, of
So
course,
I think that
Rajneesh outdid Hubbard in this, in that he called himself Bhagwan, or the supreme
yeah,
God. I said that
yeah.
to, I called him Bhagwan to a Hindu one day, and they went, what? Oh, Rajneesh.
Yeah.
But I interviewed John Sanborn. When Althea Hart left the publications division in 54, John took over, and he was there for the next 24 years. Everything that was published by Scientology went through John. And he said among the first things that Hubbard gave him was a poem called Hymn of Asia. And John looked at this and went, "You've got to be kidding," and put it aside. Because it began, "I am Maitreya." Now, John eventually, in about 1973, worked out if he changed that to "Am I Maitreya," he could do it, because he knew what that meant. Maitreya is written of in the Book of the Great Decease, which I've read, which is in the Digha Nikaya, the complete long sutras of the Buddha. And it's one of those things like the Book of Moses, where the author dies, but the book carries on going, which is incredible.
Yeah.
And in the Book of the Great Decease, you have this mention of Maitreya, which is the Sanskrit, or Metteyya, which is the Pali, who is a future Buddha. And all sorts of ridiculous claims. This is, first week that I was involved in Scientology, I was told this stuff. And so I wrote to the Pali Text Society and said, is there a prophecy of Maitreya, arising as a red-headed man in the West 2,500 years after the Buddha? And they said, well, there's a prophecy of Maitreya, but the rest is made up. And if the Pali Text Society say that, you can forget it,
Yeah.
it doesn't exist. And they said there may be some Tibetan thing where it says it, because they're a bit snotty about the patterns. But the idea is that Maitreya, when he comes, and I'm hoping it'll be soon, will lead all of humanity to enlightenment. Not will write a technology that will later take humanity to enlightenment, but within his lifetime. So I think we can quite safely say that he was wrong about that.
Yeah.
But in terms of grandiosity, he also, it's in Fundamentals of Thought, he basically says that his development is the first significant development in 50,000 years. We earlier have Fire, the Wheel, and the Arch being the three.
And that's just Dianetics is greater than
that's
these.
just at the very beginning. Yeah. So,
and he's a friend of mankind. And you could say that if Bhagwan believed that he, called himself Supreme God, Hubbard is not just God. He's the creator of other gods, because he can turn, he allows you to manifest your godliness through Scientology technology. So he is a God creator. He's, so in a way, he might be above Bhagwan even.
Yeah, and absolutely. I mean, it's one of the, I think, very insightful things that Nibs Hubbard, his son, said about him, that if he's making gods, then what is his relationship to you? He also said Scientology works, not as L. Ron Hubbard says it works, but as L. Ron Hubbard intends it to work. And if we look to 1952, not that long after Nibs had joined him, in the Philadelphia doctorate course. Don't you wish you could have got your doctorate by sitting for 6 weeks listening to some bloke talking? He says we have ways here of making slaves, which I think was true and is true and continues to be true. But he, in that same series of lectures, and somebody pointed this out to me when I was writing for Tony Ortega's Underground Bunker, and I can't remember who, and I'd like to thank them again, because I think this may be the single most significant thing that L. Ron Hubbard said. He has this point that life is a game. It's just a game. We're just playing a game. Here we are playing a game. And that in the game, there are pieces, there are players, and there is the game maker. And the job of the players is to make sure that the pieces don't know the rules. So the player is David Miscavige. Though there's a very good movie of the same. No, we won't get up into that. Is it Tim Robbins in The Player? Is it?
The Player. Yeah,
very good movie. Love Tim Robbins. You have the pieces who mustn't know what the rules are. You have the player who has to keep the rules hidden but knows what the rules are. But then you have the game maker, and as Hubbard points out, he doesn't have to follow the rules. So if we talk, for example, about the prohibition of drugs in Scientology, there is, his own admissions aside about phenobarbital and amphetamines, he told David Mayo that he'd taken LSD, and then, of course, issued this bulletin saying anybody who'd taken LSD was stupid. I had a letter from somebody whose guru, one of these small groups in California, and there were so many of them, Carlos Castaneda is probably the best known. Charles Manson's quite well known as well, who said that he was incapable of controlling anything until he had 150 hours of Scientology auditing. So that's Charles Manson's own statement, in his autobiography, recorded by Noel Emmons. But this chap, who wasn't a member of the Manson family, and I don't mean to say anything nasty about him, he wrote to me and he said that his guru had taken LSD with Ron Hubbard. And so you get this idea that, the rules don't apply to me. I make the rules for you. So exactly as you say, he is above us all. The final part of that would be his insistence that nobody had contributed anything significant to technology. And so, of course, in the early days, in Science of Survival and Scientology 8008, he gives a great list of people like, van Leeuwenhoek and Euclid and Socrates, Descartes, Spinoza, who've contributed something. Now they haven't anymore. In the last 50,000 years, the only person. So, yes, slight grandiosity, I think would be fair to say.
Yeah. All right. Next, we have Hypergraphia, which we discussed at the beginning. And after that, religiosity, holding deep religious beliefs, often idiosyncratic, multiple conversions, and mystical states. Now, this is many times described by neurologists as hyperreligiosity or enhanced religiosity by one neurologist. But with Hubbard, of course, he started a religion. you could say.
He also belonged to a religion. Again, there are allusions that he makes in the Philadelphia Doctorate course. There are 3 references that lead to Aleister Crowley. He calls him, I think it's my very good friend. It's either my very good or my very dear friend, Aleister Crowley, which he never met Crowley. And Crowley called him a lout and said he couldn't understand the idiocy of these louts, meaning Jack Parsons and Ron Hubbard. He also, in a letter to Carl Germer, I think it was, his deputy in the US, said that Hubbard was the usual con man. We know, Hubbard admitted that he'd become involved with Jack Parsons when in 1968, the Sunday Times, a journalist, Alexander Mitchell, published an article revealing the association of L. Ron Hubbard with Jack Parsons in 1945-46. Scientology threatened to sue, and the Sunday Times printed a retraction which says L. Ron Hubbard broke up black magic in America. Well, that's an admission of an involvement. The Babylon working, which is the ceremony that was performed, and I wrote a paper called Hubbard and the Occult, going into a bit more depth than I did in Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, piecing back together. And along the way, I talked with John Simons, who wrote The Great Beast and was Aleister Crowley's literary executor. So, I did have some contact with this world. I exchanged correspondence with 2 of the splintered factions of Crowley's OTO and was able to work out, and it surprised me that it hadn't been done before, that what they were trying to do was the 8th ritual of the OTO. Parsons,
which is the OTO being the Aleister Crowley's.
It's a German magical group closely related to the Germanenorden and the Tool Society. The Tool Society, of course, had people like Himmler among its. Oh, sorry, not Himmler, Goebbels among its membership, and several other Hans Frank, several other Nazis belonged to this group. When this group splintered, Crowley was offered the leadership of it, and before the First World War, Parsons and Hubbard sought to find the Scarlet Woman and bring the Beast 666 to the world, as described in the Revelation of John the Divine, the last book of the New Testament, Christian New Testament. They wanted to fulfill that prophecy, which would be the coming of Armageddon. And Parsons reckoned when Marjorie Cameron turned up, and she would become famous in her own right as an actress in Kenneth Anger's films, that he'd found the requisite Scarlet Woman, but they didn't have any children, so that didn't happen.
And that's the Whore of Babylon, right?
The Whore of Babylon, the Scarlet Woman. Yeah. As I say, there's a paper of mine on the internet somewhere called Up in the Occult, which gets in some detail, and there's a chapter called His Magical Career, which I think Tony Ortega put up on the Underground Bunker, but you could go out and buy a copy of my book, and if you haven't by now, then shame on you, what can I say? It's no good using YouTube as a substitute for true scholarship. It just doesn't work. But
okay, then
he was deeply involved in magic and magical practices, which have all sorts of beliefs around them. The most significant one is the belief that what you are seeking to do is capture elemental spirits, which is the term that Hubbard used in a set of writings called the Affirmations, and which can be found on Jerry Armstrong's site, excellent site. He and Caroline Lechterman have just done wonderful work. There's a lot of Jerry's stuff about his own experience, which has been pretty awful, and many of his own affidavits, but they've put up some of the core and fascinating material. The Affirmations were, I think, date to about 1947, and in them Hubbard is trying to get a Veterans Administration pension. Again, I wrote a little booklet which everybody should buy, and in it you have a letter that he wrote where he's basically, it's written to the Veterans Administration, and it says, "Gentlemen, this is a request for treatment," and he talks about his poor psychiatric condition. It's signed L. Ron Hubbard. But
and what's the name of the booklet?
The booklet is called Scientology, The Cult of Greed, which is a nod to Rich Behar's splendid Time article, which put him in court for 20 years or something. I basically reproduced original documents in it, and some nice pictures of Ron Hubbard in it that are not necessarily. Here he is auditing a tomato and bringing it to the state of exteriorization. That letter was written at a time when he's trying to get a pension, and he did. He claimed a pension. I think he got $38 a month.
What year is this?
1947. So, and he's at this point very much engaged with magic. The affirmations are things, hypnotic affirmations, self-hypnotic affirmations, and among them you have: men are your slaves, elemental beings are your slaves. And this is a point not to be jumped over. Elemental beings are your slaves, because contrary to popular belief and the Disney movies, magicians don't just use spells and incantations. For the most part, what they seek to do is capture discarnate beings, elementals, load them with some intention, and then direct them at the object are either the person they want to fall in love or the person, you know, they want to perform their voodoo on.
Yeah.
So Hubbard is very much involved in this thoughtscape, which we would call religious, that he is very much all the time in a spiritual world, or a we might think of as a made-up world, which is his religiosity. His son Nib said that his father told him that he read Aleister Crowley's Book of the Law when he was 16, 1927, or thereabouts. And from then on, Crowley was his guru. He was the person he most admired.
Wow.
And Scientology, in my view, is what's called a working by magicians. It is a way of, it's a ceremony. The whole of Scientology is a huge ritual with one intention, and that intention is stated on the highest released OT level and the last of the OT levels. Poor David Miscavige, since 1988, has been casting around trying to find the 14 other levels that Hubbard said he'd written and has failed to find them. But that last level is the point where people realize that Ron Hubbard is the source, the term he used for himself, of everything. So, yeah, a little bit of religiosity thrown in there, along with the mental.
Yeah, not much of a plot twist that Hubbard is the source of everything. Next, we have philosophical interest, which is described as nascent metaphysical and moral speculation, cosmological theories, and he sure had a bunch of those.
Yeah, I'm not going to bother going into any detail about that. That's what Scientology is. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's fairly glib philosophical interest. He doesn't actually cite anything from the philosophers that doesn't come from Will Durant's book, The Story of Philosophy. And of course, the original book Dianetics was dedicated to Will Durant. So there is, you know, he directly, and when in lectures he talks about philosophy, that's all you get. It's been said that James Joyce, a guy who, Constantine Curran, who went to university with Joyce during the brief period that Joyce attended in Trinity in Dublin, that Curran said, yes, he was a great writer, but everything he says in his entire oeuvre about philosophy comes from the primer we read at university, and Hubbard is Will Durant, you know. Well, I've read about philosophy. I've read Durant's book, you know.
Yeah.
Personally, I prefer Snozzle's Duranty, but there you go.
All right, we got 3 left.
Let's try and get to the end of this.
Yeah. Dependence, passivity, described as cosmic helplessness at the hand of fate, protestations of helplessness.
Against Faust at the end of his life, saying, you know, it's all a failure. I've not done that. And that did Barbara Cloden in 1950. It's that same thing.
Yeah. Next, we have humorlessness, sobriety, described as overgeneralized, ponderous concern, humor lacking, or idiosyncratic.
It surprised me as a Scientologist that his humor was making barbed comments about psychiatrists or anybody who disagreed with him. I can't think of anything genuinely funny that he said, you know, that, and he didn't seem responsive. When Jerry Armstrong, in one of the abortive technical films that Hubbard spent a huge amount of time and money on, all of which have been withdrawn by Miscavige. But there's one of them where Jerry came on, he talked about this at Toronto, and he decided to impersonate a carnival barker at the beginning of it. And he was calling the people in. And Hubbard thought he was taking the piss and assigned him to the Rehabilitation Project Force. So not much of a sense of humor, no.
Yeah, and of course he outlawed joking and degrading at some point, right? Yeah. And the final last one is paranoia, suspicious, overinterpretive of motives and events, diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia. And of course, that is part of central to the whole tragedy of Scientology.
Yes, his paranoia, which You know, in 1951, he seizes his infant daughter, Alexis Valerie Hubbard, from her mother because Sarah, the mother, has gone to court demanding a divorce, not realizing that she's bigamously married, so she doesn't actually need one, because he hadn't bothered to divorce his first wife. And he seizes the daughter to use as a bargaining tool to get Sarah to withdraw the divorce, which works. And she has a psychiatrist write a report about him. Now, I believe 2 of the first 5 Dianetic Foundations were run by psychologists. And they all went bankrupt because Hubbard took the money. But so initially he didn't have a problem with that. His work, there's supposed to be a tract called Abnormal Dianetics that was submitted to the APA. After this diagnosis, though, he decides that anybody, that any job that has the word psych at the beginning, psychotherapist, psychologist, psychiatrist, they're evil, they're in a conspiracy. And it's like, you know, the story about, you know, you get 2 rabbis in the room, you get 3 opinions. It's the same, you know, having been around psychiatrists and psychologists, the disagreements, as you know, are enormous. Yeah. The idea that they're all quietly conspiring, you know, it's only in public, is silly. But he then creates a category. And these people have been trying to destroy all life in the universe since life first began. No, 1.25 quadrillion years ago, according to him, a little bit before the Big Bang at what, 13.8 billion. Then you have the Tenyaka Memorial, the World Bank, all of these conspiracies that are out to get him. It's just, when in fact nobody was really paying enough attention to him. That's the reality, that nobody cared until he upset an Australian who asked for $3,000 back, and Hubbard said no, and the Australian had connections in the Labour Party in Australia and got the Victorian inquiry underway, and suddenly Hubbard became famous for the second time in his life. You know, in 1950 he was briefly famous, and then he struggled with a few hundred followers for years until Kevin Victor Anderson made him world famous, and people came rushing in. So yeah.
So Paranoia, and that's the end of the 18 Bear Fedio inventory traits. And I'd like to just add here that so since I came up with this speculation regarding Hubbard's epilepsy, I seem to have seen temporal lobe epileptic traits in other cult leaders like Osho, which used to be called Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, Ayn Rand, a few others, maybe even Jim Jones. But there were a couple of cases recently over the last year where I met people who have been in cults that I've never heard of, small little cults. And in both cases, when I asked them, you know, I gave a brief description of temporal lobe epilepsy, and is it a possibility that their cult leader might have suffered from this? And in 2 out of 2 cases, this is in the last, I guess, 6 months, they said, "Oh my God, yeah, this sounds a lot like my cult leader." So statistically, this is becoming interesting. So of course, you have a varied audience, and so if anybody knows of other cult leaders who write a lot of text, who feel like they were personally chosen, and you know, there's other people who are not cult leaders, like Rudolf Steiner, or you know, just
why would Rudolf Steiner not be a cult leader? Sorry.
Well, it's just that he's not as well. I don't know enough about his life, but he didn't seem as evil as some of the other people.
But I think it's an important point to make that to be a cult, you don't need to be evil. You need
Yeah.
to follow a leader with devotion or a doctrine. I got very interested in this word, the word cult. The Oxford Dictionary by 1977, which is the edition I have, the big fat shorter Oxford in 2 volumes, actually gives the last change in meaning in 1711. And it's just what I've just said. There is nothing pejorative about it. I thought for some time that it was because of sociologists and because the media had picked up the word cult. And so it's like when the Moonies said, don't call us Moonies. And you go, but you called yourself Moonies, and that's where the word comes from. Well, you can't do it. So I thought that shift in meaning had happened in the 70s, but in fact happened in the 1890s in the American Heritage Dictionary. So this is an American aberration of language. But so Steiner, I had a lot to do with anthroposophists because their UK headquarters are only 5 miles away from East Grinstead. So I knew a number of them. And while one could say that it's not malevolent, I would tend to agree with that. When you actually look into Steiner's writings, you'll find he was racist. He was also, as a young man, involved with the same magic groups that Aleister Crowley and others were involved in. And his views are bizarre.
Yes.
Gets people to do, their houses are quite nice, their architecture, but the Tobias School of Art, which is also down there, I was interested that there's a thing about Silicon Valley that people there don't let their kids have computers and they send them to Steiner schools. And it was like, okay, so I have known 3 people whose education was at Steiner schools, and they all said the same thing, that they wished they'd learned something. And when you go to art exhibitions of students of the Tobias School of Art, you can always tell, oh yeah, that's Goethe's color system we're looking at there. So it is a cloning method, as all such groups tend to be. It's not something that develops non-conformity, creativity, individuality. It is a way of, and so therefore of itself potentially harmful.
Yeah, and I think that in many cases, especially in groups who are led by people who suffer from temporal epilepsy, first of all, there is a certain authenticity in their emotions. So you can tell that they are not acting. They really are. And there is on YouTube, you can look up, there's a Nova documentary about temporal lobe epilepsy, where you see Ramachandran, the neurologist, interview someone who suffers from temporal lobe epilepsy, and you can see just how emotional and how much the emotions seem authentic and are authentic. So it's part of it's, and another thing is that if someone with this type of epilepsy, if there are cases where people describe, when the guru looked into my eyes, I felt that he understood me. He felt, I felt that he saw into my soul. Now, the thing is if that guru is actually having a seizure, he could look into a tomato or a goldfish and understand his soul, just like Hubbard does in that picture where he, but you get a little emotional contagion or a little bit of neural mirror neurons going, and you can have someone, an epileptic, look into your eyes, and you can catch that little bit of awe, which those type of epileptics feel all the time, and attribute that to, give it some kind of a miraculous or supernatural interpretation. And, and you can have someone say, when the guru looked into my eyes, I felt that understood for the first time, and that's why I followed that guru for the next 20 years, right? So many times that plays a role, but another thing that could play a role is the deterioration of such cult leaders that might be more functional or less paranoid initially, And with the years, with time, as their cult, they become worse and worse. So, we can talk about that. There might be cults that are not bad, that are malevolent, but sometimes they, the People's Temple, Jim Jones, the ones that committed suicide in 78, if you would have looked at them 20 years before, they might have looked like a good church that is anti-racist, that is anti-war. It might have looked like a legitimate and it might seem culty, but it's a good cult. Of course, then it deteriorated, and then they all committed suicide, and it was horrific in the last years.
Let's they didn't all commit suicide. Most of them were
No,
killed.
not of course, yeah,
including children. And there is a university professor. 2 of her sisters died there, and I got into a little bit of a fight with her because she was saying that they weren't brainwashed, and there was no such thing as brainwashing. And so I put it to her that both of her sisters therefore were psychopaths before they joined the group, because one killed her own child, who was Jim Jones' child. And I didn't really get a satisfactory response to that notion. It's a kind of either or. All the people that joined Jim Jones were in this condition. And exactly as you say, Jones was given civic awards for the work he did with the group, and had recruited many black people to, and talked about harmony. Yeah. And above his throne, of course, had Santayana. Those who ignore history are doomed to repeat it. And they certainly were. But yes, that deterioration, talking with people who were involved with Hubbard at the beginning, say Don Rogers, who was there when the book was written. He was one of the, you got him, Joe Winter, who wrote Doctor's Report on Dianetics about his problems with Hubbard, and Sarah Northrop Hollister. They were the 3 people who were with him. Well, I interviewed, the correspondence I had from Don Rogers is on Tony Ortega's site. And his view of Hubbard is, he was a good bloke. Never had a problem with him. Left in 1954 because my case had been cracked. And he was on the board of every foundation. So Hubbard presented in a different way. George Hay, who's the man who invited Hubbard to England in the first place, and a wonderful eccentric man, a science fiction writer himself, but an intellectual. Again, his feeling about Hubbard, talking to people who were around Hubbard in the 50s, you had a very different feeling from talking to people who were around him at St. Hill in the early 60s, where he was beginning to become tyrannical. Then talking to people who were in the Sea Organization, where he had become a tyrant. And I think that might also be something to do with sexual dysfunction. That one of the things that interested me was that he frequently talked about sexual sublimation into creative activity. And so he had some idea in his mind about transferring the libido, a very popular idea, of course, still in the 1950s when Freud was still revered, of transferring that into, in his case, the domination of people, that he got his jollies, he got his kicks by that. There was a story that Nibs's son told me, that he'd said that when they were every 6 months, when they needed some more money, they'd run an advanced clinical course at $500 a pop. And he said that his father, Nibs, had told him that Elron Sr. would take him aside and say, see if you can get them to do this. Now, the shouting at ashtrays, training routine 8, is one of those, see if you can get them to do this. And I think that's woven through Scientology. If you can get people to do absurd things, then you can get them, as Voltaire said, to commit atrocities.
Yeah. And also when you look at assess a cultic or a group like that, the weirder their behaviors are, the more likely that abuse is going on. So
yes, true.
And it's weird stuff that goes on in Scientology, and a lot of abuse.
And returning to the point you made about look into my eyes, and I felt something. such people broadcast certainty. Now, when you see them behind closed doors, it's like with Rajneesh, that Rajneesh stopped. He took a vow of silence, which meant that because he was so stoned that he couldn't talk, because even his bodyguard Hugh Milne says he was taking 50 milligrams of diazepam, Valium, a day. Maranand Sheila says he was taking 340, which would kill an elephant, as Jolly West did. That's the highest pill dose, I think, for diazepam when I looked at it is 5 milligrams. So 10 of those a day plus 2 hours of nitrous oxide. No wonder he couldn't speak. But when he got behind closed doors, he'd tell Maranand Sheila, go and put salmonella in all the sandwich bars, salad bars, fussing homeless people, So you get this division that for a few minutes of the day, or however long, they can transmit their certainty. And I think Hitler is a very good example of this as well, that people who were close to him, and he doesn't seem to me to be a very impressive man, though he wasn't quite as short as Winston Churchill, of course, but people talk about a magnetism, and I would make a division. I think there are people who are genuinely charismatic, and that when you're around them, they can be ebullient, they can be, really lively, and it doesn't matter when you see them. So our friend Christian Sherko, he's just a really nice guy, and I've known him for more than 30 years, and for me, he's charismatic. He always gives me something. I have seen him when his thyroid wasn't functioning properly, however, and long ago, and he was not so. But I think there are people who are generally charismatic, and then there are people like Hubbard who are in public one thing and in private another, and it is altogether too easy. This brings us all the way back to William James, to transmit feelings of knowing, to make people, oh, I had this incredible experience when I was with him and I realized whatever. That if we could get people to be a little bit more suspicious, a little bit more cautious
of the feeling of the really real.
The feeling
of even not suspicious at the time, but when it's over, because at the time you're so involved in it and it feels like really real. So, but afterwards to question it. But for that you need education. You need to know to suspect, to be suspicious of those kind of experiences.
And go and read my book, Opening Our Minds, which has hopefully some information on that point. Well, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much.
Indeed, we finally did it. We've been talking for a while about
7 years ago we first did this. So we've had time to digest it, and I hope that people will comment. Somebody did criticize something you said in the last video we published, and I did in the comments say that I'd suggest to you that you might look at them and answer, but I know you're a very shy person generally. So the horrible thought of looking at all the nice things that people said about you. But yes, we would love people to make comments, and
and especially if and just if someone wants to write a master's or a PhD dissertation about how different cult leaders possibly or such figures might have also been epileptic, because it's something that I don't know enough about Lee Honzai, right, the leader of the Falun Gong, or some other cult leaders that have written large amount of texts, especially, or possibly Smith, the Mormon. People have written, I think, about Ellen G. White, the Seventh-day Adventist, about her possibly being an epileptic. But it just and of course Ayn Rand, which I am certain is a temporal lobe epileptic. But it's an under researched aspect of religious psychology and religious studies. So
yeah, it's amazing thought to me, after 40 years of doing this, pretty much, just over 39 to be exact, as of the 18th of October this year, 39 years since I resigned from the Church of Scientology, that there is so much that could be researched in this field, and it's right there to look at. And you are one of the few academics I've met, one of the few scholars I've met, who's actually done that. Instead, we've got things like, well, this, let me show you this bloody awful book.
Yeah, I have that book too.
Yeah, published by the Oxford University Press, edited by James R. Lewis. And there isn't a single piece in it that is properly researched. If I'd peer reviewed it, I could have pointed out to them. I mean, I'm quoted in here, and this is really crazy, that I'm not referred to elsewise. My first name is misspelled, which I'm not keen on. There's no H in John. We couldn't afford one. But somebody quotes, because they can't say what Hubbard said about OT3, they give a description that I gave in an answer to a comment on the internet. And at the end of it, a brief description of OT3. At the end of it, I put, humbly tendered as a gift to mankind. And the person who is quoting me evidently doesn't know that this is an L. Ron Hubbard statement. This isn't me sort of doing this. So they paint me in a very bad light. But there's been such, Gordon Melton's work, just such appallingly glib work. There's a rich vein here to be, in so many ways to understand social interaction.
And for anybody who wants to reread Scientology texts in light of the possibility of temporal lobe epilepsy, look for vestibular references, which is the feeling of floating, which many involve floating or being light or being heavy, or other temporal lobe related things, which you might be able to reread parts of Scientology texts in that light and see things that you would not otherwise.
Yes, it will shine a different light on it, and perhaps help us to better resist demagogues and ideologues, people who want to push us in the direction of disaster for the sake of their own fantasy. So let's hope.
Okay.
Great.
We talked long enough. Yes.
Yeah, we talked far too long, I think. And again, somebody on the last talk we had was like, John, shut up and let him talk. It's like, well, my show. I think I tried to point out that you were perfectly capable of holding your own end of the conversation. And if you need to say something, you will. But so great stuff. And you and I will talk again next week, but we probably will keep it to ourselves.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.
Auditing a tomato